All right, it's preparing. And then I'm going to quickly turn myself on mute in just a moment after I tell you.
Okay, let's just be, well, I think let's just.
All right, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Miriam Bale. I'm the artistic director of the Indie Memphis Film Festival and the Indie Memphis Cinema, and welcome to our movie club. And this is our second edition. And for this week's movie club, we are going to be talking about Donna, Flor, and Her Two Husbands, a 1976 movie. And we are so honored to be speaking with a critic and writer, Monica Castillo. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. There are some of you are tuning in on our YouTube channel. Welcome. And some of you are here in our Zoom chat. You can, once we get to the Q&A portion, you can ask questions either through the Q&A box on Zoom or through the comments on YouTube. And all of those will get to us. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. We may not get to all of them. I also I just want to let you know, if you're here in our Zoom box for members and those of you who watched it through our stream, welcome. You can raise your hand. There's a raise their hand button that you'll see, and we can call on you, which would be wonderful. We'd love for you to join in the conversation. If you feel shy, that's okay. You can type your question in the Q&A box. If you have other questions, there's a chat box. Feel free to type them in, and one of our Indie Memphis team will get to you, and if you're having any trouble at all. Let's see, great, we have a nice little crowd, and this is the first, we started with a new film, Bacurau, last week, feels like last year at this point. And with one of the most memorable roles was Sonia Braga. And Sonia Braga is also in this film, Donna, Flor, and Her Two Lovers. And let me tell you a little bit about Monica. Monica is a film critic and writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, NBC News, RogerEbert.com, The Wrap, Hyperallergic, and elsewhere. Outside of covering film and television, Monica volunteers her time as a regional director for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. She can usually be found online talking about film, the film she just watched, and sharing old movie clips. So again, welcome to virtual Memphis.
Thank you.
Monica, so before we start talking about this film, I want to just give a little bit of background and say this 1976 film was the most successful film in Brazil for quite a while. When it came out, it held that title for 30 years. And it's, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, so we'll also be careful about in our questions about spoilers. Most of the people in this chat have seen the film. Some have not yet seen the film. So we'll try to talk around things without revealing too much. Although the premise gives away enough, and
a little bit.
Yeah, so we can talk about some of that. So before we get started, I would love, just want to say a little bit more about Indie Memphis. We are a film festival, and we run full year-round screenings most of the year, and now we're continuing our year-round screenings, doing these virtual rentals and Q&As every Tuesday. So next week, we'll be moving on from Brazil to Italy, and we'll be discussing some Italian films. If you'd like to donate, feel free to, we will put it up in our chat box where to donate and where you can become members. So Monica, I'll ask you a very leading question. What was the last film before this quarantine? What was the last film you saw in the movie theater?
My goodness, I was very lucky to see Dona Flor and her two husbands at the Quad Cinema right before all of this really started to happen. And Sonia Braga was in attendance, and she was able to share some stories, some behind the scenes trivia and facts and very colorful anecdotes. And it was just delightful to see it with an audience. I had not seen it before, but some friends of mine who were also there had. So to hear them respond to it, for me to get to see it with an audience, and then to have Sonia Braga come in afterwards and then tell us even more, was just a wonderful evening.
I bet she'd have that complete movie star glow. She just seems like
Oh yes,
from absolutely.
she's animated as ever.
Oh, amazing. And can you tell us, do you remember any of the trivia, the antidotes that?
Yes, one of them was about the music, and it was a very big deal. Like it became its own hit in Brazil. Um, Another one was that she was really good friends with the actor who played Vadinho, one of her husbands in the movie, and they just became very good friends on set. And even though they would have these very hot and heavy scenes, then they would just break for a smoke, and they would be totally fine. Um, Trying to remember what else. She had a really sweet anecdote about the first time that she came to the United States was in promotion of this film. And when she got to Times Square in the 1970s, she found that they had done like a sort of light up display of the poster with her on it. And that was when she felt like she made it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then she later moved here, isn't that right?
Yes.
Soon
Yeah.
after Kiss of the Spider Woman. We tell me a little bit about, you just touched on that this is a bit of a hot and heavy erotic film, and it's that very unusual, but perhaps my favorite genre, the erotic ghost film.
It is its own kind of subgenre now.
Do you want to talk about, tell me what appealed to you about this film when you saw it?
Certainly. And actually, this was one of the things that was interesting that came out of that screening was that there were some different readings on it, because this movie was from 1976, I believe, and it was based on a book from 1966. So now, through all the lens of feminism and the different, ways that we talk about desire and things like that, maybe the way that the relationships play out don't seem as romantic. But even then, I still kind of felt like this movie centered pleasure in a way, and women's pleasure in a way, that I hadn't really seen in a lot of movies of that era, especially not as frankly as it does, and that really struck out with me. And she wasn't being punished or shamed because of it. It was just a fact of life. She just, preferred him as a partner.
Yeah, it really, I'm glad you brought that up, because you watch it and you're like, oh, is this very feminist? But
Yeah.
it feels real in so many ways. It reminds me of a film, I don't know if you've been able to see it, this Powell and Pressburger movie that I love called Gone to Earth.
Oh,
And
no.
it has, oh, it's so good.
But I love Powell and Pressburger, so I'll watch anything.
This one, I think, also speaks. I've never seen a woman see this film and not feel moved by it. And it has this
Oh.
similar theme of the husband and the lover, and the choice between the husband and the lover. And I think in that film, you feel that she's torn. And at the end, there's sort of a transcendence. And in a way, she becomes whole through transcendence. And in this, it has a comic way of dealing with that, where in the same way she becomes whole with the with these two sides of herself. And I think it's less about the men and more about these two men express these sides of her. And I think in that way it can be very feminist. It's like the female version in some ways of like these films like 8.5, where you have this man, you know, the
Yeah.
wife, the lover, the all these choices. And yet we don't see that for women quite as much. And of course it's just fun. It's fun to see all these sides of her, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I totally love the way that her character develops to the things that she has to go through and the way that she eventually starts to stand up for herself, the way she, you know, deals with the push and pull of this desire is all very interesting. I do love that it's a kind of messy relationship on both ends, that nothing is picture perfect. Nothing is the way that it quote unquote should be.
Absolutely. And there's that wonderful line in it that happiness is not a story.
Mm.
Happiness is not a novel. It doesn't, you know, have um this this climax in the end. And I think that's also so true of and differentiating a story in a novel, which is very linear, versus film, which is can be at its best kind of messy, kind of ambiguous, kind of, you know, um all over. There's instead of, and then she ended up with so and so. There's the image of all three
Yeah.
of them, and
I love that image.
it's
They're getting
wonderful.
out of church like that.
And one's a naked ghost.
Yes.
And
Very handsome naked ghost.
that's just their reality. He is very handsome. Yeah, he's very handsome. Um, uh, and yeah, I think I love that line. We had Kleber Finso last week who
Oh,
talked
wonderful.
about Bacurau, and he loves this film as well, Donna Flor, and just said that I think he was really liked the structure of it, and I think
Mm.
that's getting at the kind of thing that you're talking about, the messiness and the ambiguity. And you also wrote a review of Bacurau. Would you like to talk a little bit about Sonia Braga about her performance
Yes.
in that film?
Yeah, it's actually quite different than the way that she performs in Dona Flor, where she has so much vulnerability and so much, you know, sensitivity. She's really like coming into her own. And in Bacurau, she plays sort of the town doctor in this very sort of remote village out in the Brazilian steppes that falls under siege through politics, through, you know, colonialism, through all kinds of different forces, and the town kind of bands together to fight against that. And she's one of the matriarchs in the village, as the town doctor. And she, even when she's messing up and she starts the movie on a very sour note, uh she's in power. She's definitely knows who she is, and she's not apologizing for it. She will admit to the wrongs that she does, but then she becomes like a force for the village to look up to and to look towards in this really uncertain time. I got the chance to also interview her, and I asked about that too. And the movie starts on a funeral, and that is what sort of kicks off everything. And I asked her, you know, her character comes out sort of angry at the person who had died and was calling her all sorts of inappropriate names. And I said, "Why did you want to play that character?" And she just very smartly responded, like, grief doesn't have to be pretty. It doesn't have to be proper. It can be messy and it can be ugly. And that's what I did. Along those lines. But yeah, it was really interesting to talk to her about that role. And we also talked a bit about Brazilian politics. Bacurau is obviously really steeped in that and really trying to answer, you know, the sort of issues that are going on with corruption and that's been going on for several administrations now, but is now really coming to the front with this next conservative government that's in power. And especially it feels like a very charged political movie right now because they are trying to cut funding to the arts. They are trying to, you know, not support artists and filmmakers as much, even though Brazil has one of the most robust film scenes in Latin America. So it's, you know, it's a very important movie. It's a very great movie. It's a wonderful movie, and the performances are all just amazing. Sonia's included.
Yes, and I loved your article, your interview with her, how much it was focused on her politics as well. In our discussion with Clever, he said that he was so drawn to her politics as a feminist, and recently with rainforest burning, and
Mm.
that he was that was part of what he was drawn. You know, it's not just, and I think you touched on this in your article, not just her face, her body, her way of expressing, but what she's expressing.
Mhm.
And actually, I found this great quote from an old article that I'll read about her, just because I don't quite understand it, but I think it's so lovely. And she said in this article, as she was becoming a sex symbol in the 80s, and with Kiss of a Spider Woman and other films, and kind of making fun of this idea of the sex symbol. She said at the time that she was being called the sex symbol, she thought, okay, well, she never considered herself beautiful growing up, and or found it late in life, when, as she said, was 24. And so when she got this label, she looked to the what was the role model of a sex symbol, and looked at Marilyn Monroe. And then when it was the 80s and that was still the role model for a sex symbol, she found that suspect and regressive, she's so wonderful in the way that she's never been afraid of nudity, and
Mhm.
embraced it, and yet with this um, with the strength. I'll read you the quote. The difference between life and movies is the camera. The difference between what you feel you are and what people think you have to be is the mirror. It's like the camera, you know. I don't have to be like the girl in the mirror. I have to respect my feelings. Sounds a bit nonsense, but I think that
No, it
I
totally
think that
makes sense about just
yeah,
like how being out in the world is a form of performance.
yeah. You know,
Yeah.
it's interesting in talking about that too, and talking about what her sexiness is and looks like. It's so interesting with this film because thinking about, like, okay, what's an erotic ghost film? What is that about? Is it about like sex is beyond the corporal? Does it mean that sex is mm, spiritual or personality? You know, and I think
Mhm.
that's her sexiness is so beyond, it's beyond the body, it's what she's projecting. And I guess a ghost an erotic ghost film is about, well, yeah, sex with a ghost is complicated. Maybe we'll get into it in the
Yeah.
Q&A.
I kind of saw it also as well as kind of the way that you remember, the relationships that really form you, and how it can haunt you, but it can also form you to and help you become the person that you are. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just it's there. So how you deal with it is how, you know, you move on through life. She also said
Absolutely.
at that Q&A that she did not think of herself as beautiful. She
Mm.
she just never saw it in herself. And it wasn't until, yeah, later in life that she kind of like, oh, okay, well, if you think I'm pretty, sure, whatever. she she is very nonchalant about it. Because someone did ask her about like, how did you feel about sort of sexualizing women on screen? And she just said that she never felt ashamed about these things. It was a good
That's
way to
awesome.
kind of like turn it back.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question as a critic, going back to sort of some of your first statements about it. How do you reckon with that as a critic? You're politically active, you're a feminist, and there are a lot of, how do you reckon with films that are messy, that are somehow speak to you on an emotional level, yet politically they're not um, so clearly black
Mhm.
and white. And um, can you tell me a little bit about how you approach that, in from that emotional, visceral response to your writing, and how you decide to tackle a film like that?
Sure. I'll use the example of The Souvenir last year, which I also really liked, but is also not so clear cut. And it was also funny to hear um, people who had a lot of problems with it, a lot of issues, the way that it depicts this really toxic relationship between a college film student and a heroin addict. And that film, at first, I was like almost angry at it. But then when I saw it again and all these different layers opened up to me. I'm like, I have to write from this response. This is the way that I, left the theater. This is what I'm still thinking about days later. I have to write about this. And then I also kind of reflected on my own experiences of, being in, bad relationships, and kind of like reflecting a bit about that personal connection. And, you know, life isn't always black and white. I can respect the movies that try to go into those gray areas. And if I can, as long as I can like talk about it and unpack it, and I can see a reason why, or what the filmmaker is trying to say or trying to do with these images and the situations that get thrown at these characters, I really respect that. I kind of almost now enjoy that kind of mental challenge of like, well, this isn't, super raw girl power, but this is difficult and complicated and something that a lot of people deal with. So I want to deal and look into that. Yeah.
That's great. I completely agree, and it's something that I feel like uh, it's always worth the struggle. That sort of coming to terms. Those are the films that I think I'm always most drawn to, and
Those are almost the
love.
most fun to wrestle with.
Your piece on the souvenir was so great.
Oh,
It
thank
really, like,
you.
I loved it instantly, and your piece made me love it even more, getting to that place. We'll tweet out for our viewers,
Ah,
we'll tweet out that wonderful review, and also your review of Bacurau and your interview with Sonia Braga, which
thank
was
you.
great. So more people can know. Let's see. I think we'll ask some questions. I have okay. So this is a question I think that's to both of us. Actually, I have to do a little bit of work for this. There's a question from Caden who wants to
Hey, Kaden.
know, hi Caden, who wants to know what's in the erotic ghost canon. And that's a very good question. And I think I'll have to follow up with some homework, but
Yes.
because some of them are more ambiguous. I think the top film in the erotic ghost canon is The Story of Marie and Julian by
Nice.
Rivette, which is one of my favorite films, and it's absolutely a top tier erotic ghost movie. Other films, like I think there are quite a few ghost films that are the eroticism is more subtle if we're talking about Hollywood films like The Portrait of Jenny,
Yes.
or The Ghost in Mrs. Muir. The Ghost in Mrs. Muir, I think, is on, for classic Hollywood, is on the
Yeah.
erotic tip a little bit. I think it's actually the scene of her dressing. I think it has things in common with this film.
I'm not sure if it 100% qualifies, but Blythe Spirit is coming to mind.
Yeah, another
Maybe
good
not
book.
full on erotic, but like definitely flirty and witty.
If there are viewers that have other erotic ghost films they'd like to add to our canon, feel free to tweet to us or send in a comment, and we will compile this important subgenre.
Oh, and Ghost, right? With Patrick Swayze.
Course. How could I forget?
Wait, because everyone's gonna come for us at that.
Thank you for saving my behind, Monica. Can you imagine if I skipped Ghost? I need to see Ghost again. I think I've seen the sort of memes from it so often, or like the scenes from it, that I've forgotten what the film is like. The Whoopi Goldberg like in Danger Girl and the sculpture
scene.
Yes.
Yes. I think the number one scene of the movie. See, I saw it on cable, so I'm not even sure I've seen the whole thing.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think
they might have edited like out that. Stuff.
Oh, that's true. I thought you meant like that you just saw it in bits and pieces. I've seen films like that, like The Devil Wears Prada. I swear I saw like parts of that film on cable before I ever saw the whole film. But that's an interesting way to watch films sometimes. If you have a question, you can write it into our Q&A box. Or again, if you're on YouTube, you can send a question to in the comments, and then it'll get to us. I want to ask you, this is kind of maybe a question that we should turn off the camera and have privately, but I as someone into old Hollywood and yet being a woman of color, I always felt like I was watching, you know, Sonia Braga. If I had seen this film when I was young, and to see her like brown body and like to see these sort of things, I think it would have been so important to me. I think that as you know, like being into old films, I just was like reaching for the brunettes, you know,
Yeah.
like any brunette is like
Yeah.
enough for representation.
Yeah.
But to have an
That's
actual,
as close as it is. Yeah.
to have an actual brown skinned woman is like, and the article I found from the 80s was talking about that, about talking about like how bizarre it was that she had hips and that she was,
Oh Lord. She is full figured.
exactly, and that she wasn't the ice blonde, that she was this, you know,
No,
exotic
because
kind of.
it's a different culture.
I know, I
Yeah.
know. Yet the one culture is dominated,
Mhm.
like what's sexy, especially then. I think.
Mhm.
Did you was she someone who you discovered more recently, or was she someone who you always thought of Sonia Braga as like a that you looked to for representation, or any thoughts on that?
So I always kind of knew about her, but the way that, you know, different folks in my family sort of referred to her was, it was more like, oh, she's so scandalous, because she would
Ooh.
show up nude, and she would do nude scenes. And you know, there's still folks from religious backgrounds who are Catholic, all that stuff, who, you know, do not look kindly on these things. um but in just like getting to see her act and actually getting to see her work, I'm like, oh, she's bringing so much to the table. Like, I'm, you know, the nude scenes are there, but it's not what I'm looking for.
Fascinating. That's interesting that that was the cultural reputation she had.
Yeah.
That's funny. I think that's what I've always thought of her as the sex symbol too. But you're right, especially in Donna Flor, you see so much of her personalities. Actually, of both of these films, they're just
Yeah.
like the gamut of the angry woman. And I also love that her hair has been her symbol for so long, including actually in Aquarius, another film
Yes.
she made by the co-director of Bacurau. And he talked about that film as being like the way that they don't make them anymore, like
No.
films, like a woman's film. He talked about, like, you know, the 30s and 40s and 50s films that are about a woman and her journey, and that we don't see as often. And in seeing these two films, you know, she can fit in that like Joan Crawford, Joan Bennett,
Yeah.
like, you know, complicated woman, complicated, strong, sexy woman.
Mhm.
And I think that's what he was aiming for with that. And then I also wanted to touch on something from your article that our viewers will be able to read. If she mentioned Marielle Franco as an inspiration, I think, for Bacurau, or in her life maybe as a
Mhm.
political. It's interesting too, thinking about Bacurau now and Donna Flor, and something that about that I would, you know, race in Brazilian society, and
Oh yes.
how it obviously not really dealt with in not obviously, but it's kind of there but not dealt with in Donna
Right.
Flor in 1926. And then it becomes a little bit more, there's more awareness of race and whiteness and the mixed society of Brazil. So it's interesting to see that in comparison to
Mhm. And
uh
that's a problem with almost every other film scene throughout Latin America too, is that generally it tends to be light-skinned folks. It tends to be light-skinned, you know, actors who get to be in front of the camera, light-skinned directors behind the camera. It's not always so obvious that, you know, you would have anyone darker skinned or Afro Latino or anything, or indigenous, even though that's a good portion, if not the majority of the population in certain regions. So yeah, and I really appreciated that she talked to me about that, because I was familiar with that story. I know a Brazilian journalist who, you know, was really upset by the news of Mario Franco's death, essentially. And it's, you know, I encourage folks to read more about it and find out what's been going on in Brazil. Um, and to hear that, you know, it really made a sort of impact on Sonia was, you know, it was moving.
Absolutely. And that shows her evolving political like how important, you know, politics aren't stagnant. Like it sounds
Mm-mm.
like her politics were always evolving. We actually had a film become a finalist for our Black filmmaker residency that was called 5 Million Mariels. And it was about using her as a figure all throughout the diaspora and using her as her struggle as something that resonated with. It was a beautiful project, and it's wonderful to see that Sonia Braga was influenced. There's another question for both of us, and this is, do either of you know much about the American remake of the American remake of Donna Flor called Kiss Me Goodbye with Sally Field, James Caan, and Jeff Bridges? Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
I've not seen it. I only just found out about it in researching this.
I,
I'm like, well, I'll give it a shot. I haven't heard too much about it, which is interesting because there are huge stars attached to it. So
Someone had tweeted at me that they wanted to see this because they'd recently seen it. If that person is on the call, raise your
let us know.
hand and I'll call on you. You can tell us about the difference. Everyone's being so shy. Well, I'll ask you, since we've talked about this, how are you, how has been we're trying this new experience. How have you been doing any group viewing experiences? What is what's your cinema in quarantine, Monica?
Yeah, well, some of it has been things that I'm researching and working on for articles. 'Cause I'm still trying to freelance on the side. But just for fun, it's some of it has been trying to catch up on things that have been languishing on my to watch list, and now they're going to expire off a Criterion channel. I've done some group watching. I now have a kind of standing appointments on Saturdays that I will watch with a group of friends, a different kind of feel good movie. The first night we watched Moonstruck all together, and then last week we watched Gymkata. And
Oh,
I
funny.
think we're still trying to settle on a movie for this week, but it's just really funny too because we haven't found a third-party app that really works for all of us, because some of us are using different devices, and you know, someone wants to project it on their TV, and I can only watch it on my laptop. So we all just, you know, it's very old school. We all stand by and we count down like 3, 2, 1, and then we press play.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We did that recently, not officially in Memphis, but we did a group. My friend Adam Neiman and I did a group watch of The
nice.
Happening, which is so scarily too true these days, too relevant. It seemed ridiculous. Now it seems too true, just too.
I feel like
just
counter
stupid.
programming. I don't feel like anything that's too heavy or too realistic. Like everyone's watching Contagion. I can't follow you there.
I totally understand. I think
Yeah.
it's yeah, but but the Happening is so ridiculous that you also can't help but laugh at it. So but it's been really interesting to find, you know, you and I both lived in New York, which is a has so many cinemas like the Quad, which are so wonderful, and for that experience. And obviously we'll all be looking forward to that experience again. But until then, to be able to find new ways of communicating and connecting through cinema using these tools that we just kind of weren't utilizing has been really interesting.
Yeah. And I've actually really enjoyed that, you know, different film distributors have worked together so quickly to help these films still get out to audiences, and there's a way to still support independent cinemas across the country, like Indie Memphis and a whole bunch of other places that we love to go to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been the coordination, and I think we all realize, like, if we're in so many crises right now, economic, health crisis, but we're also just in a crisis of of what kind of businesses will thrive if we don't all make effort every day and try to make conscious choices of what we're consuming. We're going to have the big corporations are going to eat up everything. And so thank you to everyone who watched this film through us. And we'll have another film next week that we'll announce, which I'm really looking forward to. And I want to thank you again, Monica, so much for joining you. It's so nice to see you.
So good to see you as well.
So thanks again, and we'll tweet out some of your articles. And
Thank you.
Of course, and if you have any films, if our viewers have any films to add to our Erotic Ghost canon, please send them to the Indie Memphis Twitter or to Nim Vale, which is my Twitter. All right, thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.